welcome to this special edition of the Citizens Chat Show as we count down to the end of 2025. I'm your host, Judith Atim, and it's a pleasure to have you join us on the show. In our special edition, one of the issues we are looking at is the recent M23 attacks in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we are asking, what will the Washington peace deal deliver? And I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by my distinguished panelists. From my immediate left, Mr. Charles Kazooba, Executive Director, Center for African Affairs and Diplomatic Studies. Mr. Kazooba, a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you, Judith, for the invitation. I also appreciate appearing on this platform.
Thank you. We also have Dr. Sarah Bireete, Executive Director, Center for Constitutional Governance. A warm welcome, Dr. Sarah.
Thank you, and greetings to you, dear viewers. I hope you are enjoying the festive season.
I hope so too. Last but not least, Mr. Joseph Ochieno, political commentator and UBC ideologue. A pleasure to have you on the show, Joseph.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be flanked by three fantastic citizens, and as a result, maybe next year I might consider becoming head of Center for Political Affairs and Nonviolence in the Republic of Uganda.
Okay. Sounds like you're cooking something, and we can't wait to smell what's in your kitchen. Well, just a little bit of background. On December 4th, 2025, Rwandan President Paul Kagame and his DRC counterpart, Felix Tshisekedi, signed the Washington Accords. The ceremony was hosted by U.S. President Donald Trump and attended by several other African leaders. But within days of signing this accord, hostilities resumed as M23 rebels engaged a joint Burundian and Congolese force. The conflict centered on the strategic town of Uvira, where the rebels' advance intensified the cycle of violence. The UN reports that the clashes resulted in more than 70 deaths and displacement of approximately 200,000 civilians who fled into Rwanda. Now, while Rwanda blames the Congolese and Burundian troops for the recent hostilities, it maintains its denial of any involvement with the M23. But these claims contradict a July report by the UN experts, which found evidence of Rwandan command and control over the rebels. Now, today on the show, we examine the latest wave of violence in the DRC, and we break down the facts and the fallout. What does this mean for the Great Lakes region? Can diplomacy deliver? What makes the Washington Accords any different? Will it simply be just another peace deal on paper? So, joining me on the show, my distinguished panelists, starting with you, Mr. Kazooba. When you were watching the news in the last couple of days, let's start from the signing of the Washington Accords. Did you have hope that this would perhaps at last put an end to the violence in the Eastern DRC?
Of course, no. And it's because of so many reasons. One, the spirit in which the U.S. has been mediating the talks, because the U.S. is more interested in the minerals itself. So because of that alone, you cannot see more honest discussions going on to cure the actual problems in DRC, because the biggest issue is the Banyarwanda Tutsi, which has affected 4 countries: Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, then DRC. That issue has failed to be resolved to date. It sparked off the genocide in Rwanda. It sparked off the violence in the Burundi. In Uganda, it is still a question. You've seen our president here even denying that they should be genuine citizens. Instead, they should just naturalize, even though they were born here. in DRC, they have the DRC government and the DRC indigenous people have refused to recognize the Tutsi as citizens of
DRC.
Of DRC. So to resolve that, Chu was part of the problem. But also, there had been a process in DRC from 1991 to around 1992. There's what they called the Sovereign National Conference, which is some kind of national dialogue. And it had brought everybody, all stakeholders within DRC, to table their grievances and solve the question of governance once and for all. The US is one of the actors that frustrated that process. So to date, when the Americans come in with a view of resolving the conflict, and yet the other one was a more comprehensive process that would have tackled all problems, but was frustrated by the same Americans. Then you become suspicious of the intentions today. Trump has personal problems, that is ego. He wants to be seen as a peacemaker globally. But if you've been observing, all the conflicts he's involved in have not ended. The Ukraine-Russia has not gone away. The Thailand, Cambodia, it has not gone away. Instead, they keep escalating. Now the DRC, the same thing. It is also the Americans that keep backing the Rwandan government to support the M23. So there is double standards. The DRC, the indigenous Congolese, have not been involved in the process. If you look at the peace talks that have been happening, the Angolan-led peace talks, the Uhuru Kenyatta-led peace talks, now the Qatar-American peace talks, you do not see the indigenous Congolese getting involved. And yet, these are the actual victims. Without involving the indigenous Congolese, then you'll have Mai keep wreaking havoc in Eastern and DRC. Because, for instance, the Mai claim that they are representing the interests of the indigenous, and they do not recognize the Tutsi, the Banyarwanda Tutsi.
Who have coexisted with them for a very long time. Yes.
They keep insisting that these are foreigners that came from Rwanda who have come to take their land and wealth. So they are represented by the M23. Now, without bringing these indigenous into the peace talks, you are not resolving anything at all. That aside, DRC has neighbors that also have their own interests. You have Burundi that has its own rebel groups in DRC, and therefore they keep threatening the sovereignty of Burundi. You have Uganda, which claims there is LRA, there is ADF, and others in DRC. So without bringing the neighbors on board, you are not resolving anything. That's why the peace talks that are being mediated by Qatar and the Americans, they are just on the surface. They don't resolve anything. And that's why even M23 itself has insisted that the agreement between Rwanda and the Americans does not affect their operations. For them, they will continue pursuing their own interests. However, if the US became so serious and utilized the platform of the UN Security Council, it is very, very much possible that they could tame M23. Because if you sanction, for instance, some of key figures in the Rwandan government and the Rwandan military that are directly involved with the M23, then there is a likelihood that the M23 will reduce its havoc in DRC. We've seen it happen. I think I read somewhere that even our own Andrew Mwenda had issues. And
those are UN reports that implicated him sometime
yes.
back, a few years ago.
So, but the Americans do not want to come out boldly and stop the M23. If they really wanted to, they can, using the Security Council.
Do you think, so from what I pick from you, this is just another peace deal on paper, but do you think this American involvement comes from a lack of appreciation of this dynamic that you've talked about within the DRC, especially the ethnic dynamic within this region? Do you think they actually have, they have some grounded understanding on what's at play here?
They do. The Americans are the most informed in the world when it comes to intelligence. They know everything. They understand all the dynamics in DRC. They have been involved from day one, since independence. Mm-hmm. You remember it is CIA that was involved in the assassination of Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba. You go to Mobutu, it is the CIA that largely installed Mobutu in the government and pampered him until his fallout with the Congolese. I've told you that it is even the Americans that frustrated the much comprehensive national dialogue in DRC in 1991. So it's not that they are not informed about the dynamics, but it is their interests. If you have a peaceful DRC, are you going to take the minerals cheaply? I don't think so. So partly the violence helps people who want to plunder Congo. They can take those minerals cheaply and benefit at the expense of the citizens. So the international community, the key players, very few are interested in a peaceful and empowered Congo. You don't want to have a government that is able, for instance, to govern effectively. Because if you govern effectively, then you are most likely to make decisions that tamper with the flow of the mineral trade. We saw when, for instance, Kabila was about to get out of government, he made a very serious deal with the Chinese. I think over $10 billion, I think. Yeah, around there. In exchange for infrastructure, that the Chinese would take out the minerals, then build infrastructure projects, roads, hospitals, schools. When Shekedi came in, the first thing the West told him was to terminate that deal with the Chinese. And actually that became a source of conflict. Now, a serious government, which is very effective, shows you that they can actually, for instance, decide to process their own minerals, add value. This is what part of the negotiations we're talking about, that they should process, for instance, the gold from DRC. However, the international, when we talk of the international community, I'm talking of the key players. That is not what they want. They want raw materials, so that they add value and then sell them back expensively.
Yeah.
So that can only happen in an unstable Congo, in a Congo that is inflicted by violence. A peaceful one, you can't do the things that the international community wants.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Sarah Bireete, I think many months ago we had a similar conversation on Congo. I don't know if it was last year. And you actually said very similar things to what Charles here is saying. The instability. I remember you were saying, who benefits from the violence in the DRC? When this accord was signed, there was some hope for some people. But I remember again, earlier you had said you did not see much hope. Has that changed in your opinion? Is this still, or are you with Charles on the same page? This is just another deal on paper.
No, nothing has changed. And to prove some of us right, indeed after the signing of the deal, there was increased fighting and the capture of a new town, except now M23 is trying to withdraw. So then maybe to add on, and Charles has given a very good background, but I just want to add on briefly on the details of the protocols. The Washington deal has 5 protocols, and the first protocol is on ceasefire and suspension of hostilities, where it considers, you know, DRC government and M23 rebels to disarm immediately. But M23 rebels were never on the table. I don't know whether negotiators, both in Doha, in Washington, in Angola, it's only in Nairobi where there was an attempt to say we need M23 on the table.
Yes,
I don't know whether negotiators think that they can negotiate for a party, on behalf of a party, at the front line, or if they think that Rwanda represents M23. I don't know. And I don't know whether Rwanda makes that insinuation that they are
On behalf
officially that they represent M23. I've not seen that come out, but M23 is not on table. And so they are not bound by these agreements. Yeah. So even when you say Protocol 1 is ceasefire and suspension of hostilities, they have not signed. They've not discussed with anyone. So they are not bound. Except now they've agreed to withdraw, but for how long? Because they are not party to the agreement. If you look at the second protocol, again, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of M23, have they signed up? Because now they have a clear political leadership in their structures. Before they were hiding, but now they have leaders, they have political commissars, they have, especially in that region, they have captured and they are trying to establish a government. So you need them on table for these things to hold. Protocol 3 withdraw foreign forces and military support, especially targeting M23. Both DRC and Rwanda have committed. I don't know whether in the background of this, I've not read the whole agreement, but I don't know whether Rwanda in the introduction says they are the ones responsible for the conduct and acts of M23. President Kagame has been denying, saying as much as he supports their cause, he has not officially owned them. So you have this agreement that is dead on arrival in terms of the parties on table. Protocol 4 is on political dialogue and national reconciliation, which would again take us back to the conference Charles was talking about, and then humanitarian assistance and development aid as Protocol 5. The deal has collapsed in its first month. No ceasefire, no ceasing of hostilities, offensive or defensive. It reignited the fight. So I don't know whether the guarantors, in this case the Washington team, can go back on table and call the actual leadership of M23. Because without them on table, it's another waste of time. When the Nairobi conference attempted to invite M23, the DRC government opposed it. So I don't know whom do they want to negotiate with. And if Kagame says, I'm hands off, But M23 keeps fighting. So what do they achieve? Because he told them that in Nairobi. He said, look, you need to dialogue with the people that are fighting. I associate with their cause. I support their cause for self-determination and enjoyment of their rights as citizens. But you need to talk to them. So a lot of things have changed in terms of Doha. Doha agreement was not given a chance. And I don't know what that rush was about. That Doha agreement is signed, the first part and second part, and it's concluded, and then immediately you have the Washington deal. I don't know what that was about. Is it a competition of who can deliver peace? Because the Doha agreement was never given a chance. Also, I want to refer to the comment made by Trump after signing. Everybody's going to make money. He did not say that everybody's going to have peace. Everybody's going to make money. I was watching CNN and I'm like, okay, so what is the driver of that deal? Everybody's going to make money. Are people fighting to make money? I think the militias who control territory in that Eastern DRC are making more money. Probably. So we need to look at DRC, and then I want to focus at DRC and what is it. You have developed parts of DRC. I've not been beyond Kinshasa. I've been to Kinshasa twice. I've not had a chance to go beyond Kinshasa. But I'm told there are cities where you go and you think you're in France. Highly developed. And then I want to make an attempt to go there. Peaceful, highly developed, and people are living upper middle income and first class lifestyles in those cities, stable. Then you come to the DRC, where the Eastern DRC, where there is total absence of government, no roads, occupied by militias. The last count by the International Crisis Group was 133. And then you have M23, because it's not part of the other militias. It's a rebel group fighting for power and recognition by government. The other militias are just making money. I have my territory. I can mine minerals and sell them. And then the outsiders who fly planes in this underdeveloped Eastern DRC, inhibited by all rich resource minerals that everybody needs to develop, especially under the digital revolution, but also where the world has moved to more climate smart, interventions. So are these foreigners flying in to smuggle minerals out of DRC? Are they ready to give DRC a chance? Because if I were Washington, given that it's a superpower, I would first call these people flying in DRC to pick minerals and tell them whether they prefer to trade with a normal democratic government in DRC, or they prefer to trade with the militias and avoid the taxes and get the minerals cheaply. Because that's the first problem and the major problem of DRC. So let's pick these conflict entrepreneurs who are flying jets and maybe close the airspace in DRC so that they cannot fly in. To fly in, you need to be on official duties. Close that airspace for 1 year. That war can end. They are the biggest problem. It's not even M23.
The conflict entrepreneurs.
Yes, they are the biggest problem of DRC. So I would rank them number 1. And they are known because the tracing of minerals and their sources. So let's first have them on table. Can they stop this trade and wait to deal with a democratic government where they will get licenses, pay taxes, and pick this trade officially from a government? Or they prefer what Ugandans would call magendo, illegal trade, smuggling of minerals. That's the biggest problem of DRC. The second biggest problem is contested citizenship, where you bring in now the M23. You can also bring in the other Tutsis that have been there before, led by Bizimakaraha and others. Call all people who consider themselves Congolese. Do your research. After the demarcation of borders, where were these people? Trace their second, third, fourth generations backwards. At independence, where were they? Their families, their relatives, where were they? If they were in DRC, give them citizenship rights and recognize them. You will solve that conflict. And then number 3 is focus on reconstruction and development of DRC with proper governance, either as a federal, because it's so big. I think it's the biggest country, followed by Nigeria.
Yeah.
Nigeria has a federal arrangement because of its size. That's an option they can consider because it's too huge. Enable each region to develop, agree on quotas for these mineral-rich regions. What quota of resources goes to the central government? Make it governable, and then engage in normal trade like other countries. That conflict will be solved. In the absence of that, it cannot. So now you go to the very weak leadership under Felix. It's Sekedi. Very weak. People had thought that maybe Kabila was weak because of the way he came to power, at 28, having been an army commander, and then his father is assassinated, and then he takes power. But second, on the other hand, the young one was largely given power because of the legacy of the father, who was the longest fighter for democracy in DRC since independence. But the young Felix enjoyed his life in Belgium, he enjoyed his sausages, and then he's picked to take power, having not been part of these struggles of the father. And the way he's leading is really telling. So that dialogue now that would happen would help come with a reconciliatory government that can reconstruct the country and they get moving.
Thank you. Joseph, is this accord dead on arrival? And what does it take to actually stabilize Eastern DRC? Or what would it take?
I think both of my colleagues have said it in such a manner that in normal times I would say I've got nothing useful to add. But that said, I'll attempt to make sure that my chair is useful. One is that at the heart of the whole thing really is that everybody will make lots of money.
Yeah.
Everybody. So if everybody's going to make lots of money, then your argument, Sarah, for the other militias collapses, as you lawyers would say, on arrival. The non-formal militias are making lots of money, and if they're making lots of money, that means that the natural thing is for them not to go through the formal process. That is the silliness of global capitalism. Grab, grab, and grab. And if that is the case, it's absolutely commonsensical, almost understandable, and that's why we are here. We should check it, that people want to go and loot and not pay a penny. And people want to go and loot without going through formal processes. The other day, last week, maybe I should bring it actually to make the point. I have a relative who's struggling basically to receive a used phone into Uganda through a formal agency. And the amount of money being asked is more than two police officers' salaries, the price of a phone, kind of stuff. And it's crude, and you begin to say, why, why, if you could get shortcuts. That's why it's important. Kagame in normal times will talk about governments and systems. my young struggling brother Gregory Muntu talk about systems and institutions, and that is why Africa needs to wake up. Lots of money. But number two, though, is the sovereignty question in Congo, which is actually the critical. Dead on arrival, Congo, the critical stuff. But most importantly, three, Charles has talked about this almost as the Tutsi identity question. Actually, at the heart of it is in part the Tutsi identity question, but that you can really only draw it back to possibly the last 50 years, going back to 1959, thereabouts. That's 60 plus. But the primary thing is where Trump is, where Belgium is, where Anglo-American North, global North is, and excess capitalism is, which takes us back to slavery, and which takes us back to the divide of Africa breaking it into suites, and which therefore takes us back to the fact that up to the time of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the issue was about resources. Still brings it back to Trump, you know, Congolese resources. So these guys wrapped economically Congo. These guys wrapped Congo humanly, and they have done so. The Congolese problem can't really be left to Congo alone per se. And while it's absolutely true that Tshisekedi would be the leader solution, the Congolese problem, if it was only left to Congolese, maybe you'd confine about a national conference, things like that first. But because of the mixes, Uganda is in Congo, Rwanda is in Congo, Burundi is in Congo, I think Angola is in Congo, and you can count some of the other neighboring countries in Congo. Partly for the same reasons, partly mixed with this identity question. If only the neighbors to Congo were genuine African countries with African leadership, if only the East African community was a genuine East African community of our founding parents, lest you forget, partly because of Congo, we got Idi Amin. You know, as early as 1961, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the involvement of Nelson Mandela, and then Milton Obote coming in, you know, lest you forget, you know, the largest haul at Makerere versus Lumumba. But the point is this, that these independence African leaders, including Nkrumah, actually part of the assassination of Nkrumah was actually in part because of Congo, because Nkrumah even tried to send rescue teams to try and save Patrice Lumumba, Sarah, lest you forget, you know. So at the time, as early as 1962-63, it was this thing that these independence African leaders, Obote, Nkrumah, and one other, I think I forget the other guy's name, three, you know, were saying that, as part of the Gulf of Africa, and part of this Venezuela of Africa, which is Congo, this is the heart of our African resources, you know, and they've killed Patrice Lumumba. So this guy's job was to politically mobilize, organize, secure Congo in the manner in which Sarah is trying to talk about. Give Congo its sovereignty, but we broad enough as Africans to make sure that we're able to turn our resources into real, genuine African resources for Congo and indeed rest of Africa. These guys were beaten and broken as early as the time. 1966 so-called gold scandal. In part, and I've told this program before, in part, Amin got involved in gold deals, you know, not rep, but gold deals, you know, like what these guys are doing. But Amin had been sent there by Obote because Amin was Uganda was supporting Lumumba's forces in Congo. And as Charles says, the CIAs couldn't have it, you know, so they had to dismantle and in fact, they're the ones who provided the intelligence to Ugandan opposition that your guys are doing this, so this business of an enemy to an enemy, use them and beat it. So point is, this was those early attempts. So, you know, I've not even talked about the identity thing of the Banyarwanda or the Tutsi question. So resource, is it a resource curse? African leaders, the introduction, African leaders of today just shock me that they don't have this basic information, because it's a TV program for which we can't really say everything. in a few minutes, So the attempt at independence is completely absent today because the current leaders are basically client states for Western imperialism. Uganda and Rwanda, client states for Western imperialism. It was deliberate. The push for Museveni and Kagame, and Afeki and Malays as new breed of African leader. It was not for African independence, but basically to protect, as what they call them, the Nyampalas, to have the good boys to allow us exploit the resources of the region. And that is the actually fact. If you go into the details, and Sarah's fantastically right, common sense, why couldn't you have the M23s there? I was thinking through then, I remembered that, these actors, Museveni and Kagame, are smart boys, man. These guys, give them credit, extremely intelligent, smart guys who've done their bit, partly for themselves, but partly for the bidding of their masters, even if they're old masters. Nairobi peace jokes, Museveni manages to push their friends, the Tito Kellos, to so-called peace talks in Nairobi. These guys were supposedly talking in Nairobi, but Museveni was rearming, recruiting, mobilizing, consolidating propaganda with the back of the Western powers. I would not be surprised, because I thought about that. I would not be surprised that the Washington thing was, do it, while you're playing M23. I have an interest, and I don't know how much I can go into this. The Irish struggles involving the IRA and Sinn Féin, was Sinn Féin part of IRA or not, that kind of thing. Whether we like it or not, the way Kagame says it, that look, I support their cause. Can you imagine? I support their cause. They're not part of me. I support their cause. Some of the things are neither here nor there. Intelligence suggests that Rwandan forces are up to several thousands embedded in this. Mm-hmm. That is one. But number two, why M23 only? Why not FDDR? I've actually argued here, I think the conversation you're referring to earlier, that maybe one of the answers to this, and this is really an important thing, by the way, guys, and this is Christmas season, maybe we should review, that while we should look at the legitimate grievances of M23, we should also look at the legitimate grievances of FDLR. And if some of those are Rwandese, we should also subject Kagame to talking to those people. Now, there's some of them who are basically alleged Rwandese refugees who are there. In fact, in any case, some of them are Rwandese refugees who were there following the genocide. Let Kagame also talk to them. Let's also have a regional conference in which the Ugandan rebels in Congo, we also have, including ADF, let's have Museveni talk to these people. So let's have an open regional conference, including the grievances of those of Burundi. Mm-hmm. Okay, guys, this is official. Let's open up a regional conference in which
on DRC.
On the region, sort of call it on DRC, but in which Uganda is involved. Uganda talks to Ugandans in DRC because Uganda is there. And by the way, the smartest thing that Museveni has done is to prove Museveni is not mentioned. Partly his smartness, but partly I also know some other geopolitical strategy kind of stuff, which you see Uganda is really not mentioned. But the mix in Congo is very clearly the case that Uganda is deeply involved in these things, including the mineral exploitations there in DS Congo. So this thing will possibly not be resolved through fighting. Now the shock.
Our gold exports have gone up. Where does it come from?
But there's denial also from our government that our gold is coming from.
No, but what we're saying here, what we're saying here is this is official. You can only get it from the citizens. So that unfortunately the thing. But Judith, to conclude this bit, the amount of wealth in Congo is huge. Charles and I were talking as we come to program, just to conclude. If you consider how young, intelligent, clever Ugandans and Africans are wasting themselves in Europe and North America and other places. I know professionals, some of my OBs and friends abroad, top-range professionals, who would come home to work for just $1,000 or $2,000 if only home was okay and they could get these jobs on merit. I know powerful engineers who would sort out the mess down in Chira that delayed me by a few minutes and you and others over starting our programs. But they're building other nation states. We've got the systems here. We've got the monies, both in this country and in Congo and many other spaces. So the the resolution of conflict in Congo is not for Congolese only. It is for the region and most important, the African continent. A global media network invited me and I was furious. How dare, lots of money, that you resolve, you deal a peace thing on the African continent on the basis of how much money you're going to make. Lest you forget the point Sarah was making, because I've been making a lot of noise here, So peace in Africa, involving by the millions of African lives lost. And by the way, Judith, I know you know this, I want to repeat, Sarah. Shortly before we became friends, me, I've been friends with you for a long time. But even earlier before that, once upon a time, Charles, it used to be the case that in London and other places, we would have conversations about Congo. Rape of women and rape of children. And some of the Western media houses would refuse, would reject, and would look for Congolese friends to be able to push it. So what is going on in Congo, which is actually not formally covered in the media, is absolutely atrociously unacceptable. And so for a country that would in itself transform this country, this continent, is unfortunate. So no, I think African citizens need to, if you've gone to Lumumba Hall in Makerere University, or if you're associated with the Ende Lumumba, or if you pretend, boo, you're a Pan-Africanist, we need to begin to mobilize ourselves, organize ourselves, demonstrate, demand, go to universities and colleges and institutions, and do what we did as young people in Southern Africa, and begin to demand that our governments get involved, and that actually maybe the USAs and Qatars of this world push aside. Of course, they will not, and we're not saying we're pushing them away versus the others, but really critically, this is really the reason for which we fought for our independence. But, these guys have come back, new colonial big and at the center. It's a shame that this thing went to Washington and it was not in Addis Ababa, and the AU is quiet. And then as long as that's the case, and unless we review these things, I'm not sure it's going anywhere.
Well, thank you.
Just 1 minute on the conclusion. As he was concluding, I remembered the school chairs that the AU leaders were sitting on, witnessing the signing.
Well, so
maybe it served them right.
No comment.
Wow. Let's leave it at that. So a lot of things, of course, have come up from your submissions. The Tutsi identity question and the instability in Congo and, the external interests or even the internal interest that it speaks to. But Joseph, you're saying, Congo, this is the Venezuela of Africa or the Amazon of Africa. Certainly it is. But, and I'm glad you already spoke to, what the conflict there means to the Great Lakes through your submission. But I want us to now talk about the role of all these players, because certainly securing Congo and governing Congo works in the interest of the Great Lakes and by extension the entire African continent, looking at the wealth, the resources that Congo has. But where is the voice of regional actors across the continent, whether it's the EAC, it is SADC, it is COMESA, the AU itself? Where is their voice in all this?
Do you mind me actually saying something very
quickly, then I come to Charles.
If you don't mind, really, actually, it's very important on the Tutsi question. I think it's very important. Really very important. Because while we discuss press threat of genocide in Uganda and seeking to mitigate political genocide in this country, a genocide really in this country, considering the political mess in which we are. There was a genocide in Rwanda in 1959.
Yes.
And there was genocide in Rwanda in 1994. How we don't learn, I don't know. There is, and these are people don't want to talk about this. I think, let me say it here actually. I was, quite some time ago, nearly 2 decades ago, involved in a conversation with a regional diplomat from outside immediate East Africa. And this person was telling me that one of the biggest, a very senior diplomat actually, one of the biggest threats facing this region is the question of the Rwanda identity. I really don't want to give too much context about it. So really, one of the things, if you see what's happening in Rwanda, in Congo, there is an element of sometimes pushing almost either blame or an identity blackmail thing You know? We need to address these things very openly. In 1959, when genocide happened, what did Milton want to do as the head of the opposition in the Legislative Assembly in Uganda? Simply said, no, these are our people. You know, they must be allowed. And we compelled the Brits, you know, to allow the Banyarwanda in Uganda, opening up these progressive refugee policies and things like that. But what happened, you see, what happened in the early 80s, which is again a discussion people still don't want to have, where the Banyarwanda refugees, away from the Banyarwanda Ugandan citizens, you know, were unleashed into war with Museveni for a strategic reason, in part maybe to return to Rwanda. Because this is the things people don't talk about. People don't know that some regional friends and partners and observers see these things. So there is a huge risk actually of confining these things of the Banyarwanda Tutsi or Tutsi versus the others. But actually, maybe every identity, Tutsi, Hima, Hutu, Jupadola, we need to review ourselves on how we conduct ourselves, including how we want to attain our identity, our emancipation in political and economic emancipation. Maybe we need to be able to review that. But I don't think we're going to leave these things to Jupadola, Tutsi, whatever. I think we need to have an open political conversation as a sub-region, including where you think an Ochieno, Nagongara thinks Nagongara is whatever kind of stuff. I think it's a debate we need to be able to have. I'm really sorry, but I hope it makes sense.
Yeah. Charles, the voice of regional bodies or blocs in the Congo question.
When Felix Tshisekedi came into power, we had hopes. Of course, he was smuggled into power. He didn't win elections. Came into power as a result of an understanding between him and Kabila and the Catholic Church. But we had hope that after joining the EAC, you know, Kabila had refused. He had refused to join the East African community. He preferred to deal with the SADC.
Yeah.
So we had hope that the Congo question would be tackled under the framework of the East African community. And then at a larger level, the African Union. However, he made some 2 or 3 blunders in his first term of office. And I don't know why he made those blunders, because immediately he was president, he had a very good relationship with President Kagame. At that time, Kagame was chair of the African Union. So they agree to even do business. We even saw Rwanda Air begin conducting flights to DRC. Then they agreed to put a refinery for gold, all these things. But Felix had promised in his manifesto that he would stabilize Eastern DRC. And that was a big thing. So to do it, he thought it was a simple task. He first deployed his military failed totally. But also he made a grave mistake. He abandoned his agreement with Kabila and started purging government, removing all Kabila's people, including parliament. Actually, for parliament, it took like 2 years for Felix to be fully in charge of parliament, because initially it was Kabila's people. So that started weakening Felix. The fact that Felix lacked legitimacy, he came into power, not because he had won. And here he was fighting a person that actually brought him into power. So that weakened him. He therefore decided to run to the region. He came to Museveni, he went to Kagame and asked them to help him deal with Eastern DRC. At first, they were very hesitant because, you know, Uganda and Rwanda, we are just, at that time, we weren't even talking. We instead shooting each other as citizens after the Katuna closure. When Kagame took long to respond, Burundi and Uganda worked out an arrangement and responded. They deployed unofficially. That triggered the biggest, the current conflict. That's when M23 was reactivated. Immediately Kagame reactivated M23 to counter our deployment in Congo, because these people, it's like they have partitioned Eastern DRC.
Yeah.
They have
The
their
territories.
territories.
Yeah.
So the Rwandans feared that we are now going into
Their territory.
into their territory, and that would of course threaten them. So they reactivated M23. That is when the regional framework now collapsed, because we would have worked as the East African community, not individual states. That's why even the deployment of troops eventually failed. We couldn't deal with M23 because there was no agreement at the regional level. Tanzanians had issues. You remember, it is Tanzanians who flashed out M23 in around 2012.
With South Africa.
Yes, with South Africa.
Yes.
In fact, that caused a lot of bad blood between Chikwete and Kagame. They were not seeing eye to eye. So once the East African community failed to have one voice on DRC, SADC took advantage. Sheked now ran to SADC. He actually wanted to abandon EAC all of a sudden, before even fully establishing DRC membership within the region. So he runs to SADC. SADC has its own agenda. In fact, SADC's agenda has not started today. Even during the peace talks between Kabila and Mobutu, the peace talks mediated by Mandela and eventually then Zuma helping, you would see that there was an agenda which is totally different from ours. So we've never...
What do you think was the differences, critically, at the time?
You see, SADC also wants to exploit, and they are more advanced than us.
And the ESC.
Than the ESC. They are even better organized. But their agenda is based on purely neoliberalism, which is a little bit from us, because you realize that it is the South Africans and Nigerians that influenced actually the formation of AU on neoliberal basis. They insist on democracy, human rights, blah, 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 which do not work with us. Because for us, you know what we are.
I don't.
What are we? Just answer that question. What are we?
Our beliefs are different.
Okay. All right.
Now, SADC, unfortunately, this time also South Africa had its own internal dynamics. And therefore they could not help Shekedi the way he had wanted. That's how Shekedi ends up running now to the West for assistance. Meaning that the Africans had failed. So the blocks, the ESC could not help, SADC could not help, the African Union could not help. And of course, African Union is understandable at that level. They are also beggars. They beg resources from the West.
Yes.
Now, the fact that as a continent, we could not deal with the DRC issue, the West has taken advantage of that gap. And it is going to be very costly. This thing might seem a small issue. For the Americans to come and establish themselves boldly, even for Trump to say we are now demanding for peace, but in return we want business in the form of minerals. That could result in the collapse of some of the governments within the region. That is what I've been thinking.
So if I hear you, what you're saying is that the dependence of our regional bodies, including the AU and others, on Western funding and support renders these bodies voiceless, and therefore they cannot exert their authority as African actors in the affairs of the DRC.
That is part of the problem, but also at the individual level, failing to agree. Like I've told you, that President Kagame, President Museveni, could not sit down and agree to say, look, this is how we should tackle the DRC problem. We have issues. Yes, it is true. Our survival is partly threatened by people in Eastern DRC, but we can handle it at a regional level. Now, failing to agree on that became a problem, but also the dependence on the West for assistance became now another issue. So today, it is not going to be business as usual. The leaders that are likely to threaten the American interest in DRC will have a raw deal. There is a likelihood that they could lose their
leadership
seats.
positions.
It is very, very likely. Because from what I'm seeing, the US is taking a lot of interest in Nigeria, in DRC, and I think 2 other African countries. So they are putting a lot of energy in the African continent. Now, these leaders who still believe that they will keep siding with the Chinese at the expense of the Americans on the African continent are going to have issues with the Americans very, very soon. So the issue of our even internal governance here could likely be a result of how you relate with the American interests in the DRC. So they have to be very, very careful. I saw the UN Security Council issue a statement that Rwanda was threatening the stability, territorial integrity of DRC immediately when M23 resumed fighting. And it was very, very quick. It was very, very fast. And I knew Kagame was playing with fire. Yes, you can be friends with the West, but those people will always emphasize their national interests.
Yes.
They have no permanent friend. Therefore, Kagame, Museveni must realize it very, very soon that the Americans are on their doorstep. The Americans are in DRC not just as a joke. They want money for their people, and to have that money, they need peace in the region. So the earlier, the better for the region as a bloc to understand that the Americans are going to take DRC very, very seriously. Even when Trump leaves, I don't think the next president will just abandon what is happening in DRC.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. I'm told it's time for us to take a break. Then when we return, I will give Dr. Sarah Bireete and then Joseph Ochieno the mic. We're still continuing with our special edition on the Citizens Chat Show. Our topic is the M23 attacks in DRC. What will the Washington peace deal deliver? My name is Judith Atim. See you shortly.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create, and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices, and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Welcome back from the break, and we're glad that you're still with us here on this special edition of the Citizens Chat Show. Of course, this is our special edition for the festive season. I'm your host, Judith Atim, and our topic is the M23 attacks in the DRC. What will the Washington peace deal deliver? And I'm joined by Mr. Charles Kazooba, the ED for the Center for African Affairs and Diplomatic Studies, as well as Dr. Sarah Bireete, Executive Director, Center for Constitutional Governance, and last but not least, Mr. Joseph Ochieno, political commentator and UPC ideologue. We're done with you, Charles. Coming to you now, Dr. Sarah Bireete, on the question of on the voice of regional bodies or blocks in the question of the DRC. We've not had much from the AU. We've only seen statements in the past, including from IGAD, but we don't see the zeal to actually push for actual realization of peace. Just like you were all saying, understanding, dissecting the root cause of this conflict and actually having a well-thought approach to bringing this conflict to an end. What do you think is the problem?
Well, what regional bodies are we talking about here? You have the East African Community, where DRC is a new member, about 3 years old. Mm-hmm. You have SADC, where they have always belonged as a regional bloc. You have the African Union, which unites all the 55 member states. But also you have the special mechanism of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. So the biggest indictment, in my view, would be on the commitment of the leaders in the Peace and Security Pact, on the protocols for non-aggression, for disarmament, for exploitation of mineral resources, including establishing a center for certification, tracing of mineral resource in the Great Lakes region. Where has it gone? The commitments under the framework of the East African, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. When Joseph was saying we need an international conference, that's why I kept saying for DRC, because for the region it exists. And I think the challenge as usual is leadership, is implementation, is a lack of commitment to the agreements and decisions that our leaders make. Under the framework of the ICJR, you would not expect things like this to happen. With the guarantors as the African Union and the UN, I remember when Nkunda first arose in DRC. And maybe to add on what the colleagues have said, you know, it's a, Joseph was saying, maybe we open up DRC and each of the neighbors picks their people. You have the situation of the ex-FAR in Terhamwe. And I remember in the negotiations of ICJR, I don't think it was ever resolved. Rwanda kept insisting, and part of the protocols on good neighborliness and commitment was that you cannot harbor enemies of your neighbor. So you have people who were part of genocide in Rwanda who ran and took refuge in the DRC part, largely ungovernable, the ex-FAR in Terhamwe. And they pose, in my view, a genuine security threat to Rwanda. On the other hand, because they can easily reorganize, acquire resources in this ungovernable mineral-rich Eastern DRC, acquire arms, and attack Rwanda. For Uganda, we have a genuine threat of the ADF, now turned into the international terror group, IS. And it's a genuine threat. Murders, attacks on Kasesa, neighboring regions, attacks up to Kampala, recruitment, terror cells. We've been fighting with ADF for more than 20 years. And they are housed
Eastern DRC.
in Eastern DRC, where there is absence of government. You have the Burundi rebels in the same region. What should then happen? Why can't these countries feel the need to secure their territorial integrity by pushing back on these armed groups or negative forces, as the pact calls them, in the Eastern DRC? And what would be the solution? On the other hand, for Rwanda, so you have, I know we all have interconnected tribes. You have Luo in Uganda, Luo in Kenya. You have Tutsi in Rwanda, Uganda, DRC, and Burundi. Although in DRC they are called the Banyamulenge. You have the Kasese, which has relatives and whatever across border. So when you say that Tutsis in Rwanda, in DRC, should go back to Rwanda, do they belong there? Would it be fair if you went to Busia and told the people, including families, because you have the Agura family in Kenya, Agura family in Uganda, would it be fair to tell them, the Agura family,
Go to Kenya or go to
Kenya?
Uganda.
Are they the ones who created these artificial borders that divided communities? So, and I'm not justifying the interest of Rwanda on this, but I want to highlight some of the complex issues that have kept this longest ever conflict, the Sikh man of Africa, going in DRC. But at the height of this complex situation is lack of leadership in Africa in general. And I did comment when I was saying maybe it served them right. I think, and I don't sound like Museveni, the problem of Africa, because the problem of Africa is leadership. Yeah, those who stay longer make it even worse. Maybe that's the amendment I would make.
Then you don't sound like Mr. Museveni at all. No, you don't.
I know when you say what is the problem of Africa, because the mind goes to his book, which he went against. So you have this lack of leadership in Africa. Even when you think a leader is good and brilliant and can contribute largely to solving of this complex situation, then they become selfish. And I want to borrow the example of the old ECOMOG in West Africa. The days when West Africa had ECOWAS with the military, structure of ECOMOG, with the Obasanjos in power, they caused stability in that region, and they had ended coups. You take over power with the use of arms, they would give you 2 months to organize elections, or ECOMOG moves in. And ECOMOG moves in within 1 week. They will have hit the nonsense out of you. They were no joke. So maybe we need such structures back in the region. The East African community tried to negotiate peace, including deploying a peacekeeping force led by a general from Kenya, who later resigned. And the resignation had its own controversy that we would take long if we delved into it. And later the peacekeeping force failed. After that, the SADC, other than what Charles has shared, SADC has tried each time they intervene in the DRC. And the basis of the ICJR were countries which were directly affected or involved in the DRC conflict. The 11 member states hosting refugees, harboring negative forces, and I wish the leaders had implemented what they committed to do. We wouldn't be here. But now that we find ourselves here, must the solution be Washington generated, or it has to be indigenous generated? The Nkurumas used to talk of local solutions or African solutions for African problems, except that they were also aggressively fought and later removed from power. But you cannot solve such a complex problem through sitting in Washington or Doha. That's my view. You need to sit in Kinshasa. We need now an international conference on DRC, or a national conference on DRC, where they invite observers, like these countries which are involved in the conflict, but Washington then can come in as an international guarantor with Doha. Yeah, but these things of Washington are not going to work.
With Doha and Beijing. Because Beijing is also interested with
Yeah, let them come in as international guarantors. And the neighboring region come in as observers. Then the others are guarantors. But let the Congolese find a solution, which is largely absence of leadership.
Thank you. And that takes me back to the question of sovereignty, Joseph, which we were discussing earlier with Charles, and he said he doesn't see that sovereignty in the region. When you have your neighbor running thousands of miles away to find help, what does that say about African sovereignty? Don't we really have the power to actually keep our own houses in order? Don't we have the powers to go and put out our neighbor's house, to put out the fire in our neighbor's house? What does this tell us about comradeship, about sovereignty, about, where we are or who we are as a continent?
In the late 80s, as a young, sharp student, I thought I knew it all. And particularly the later part of my exile, when I was heading the All Africa Students' Union in Europe. Again, I was a very utopian and completely believed that all these things are possible, which I still do. But at the time, I was extremely convinced that once Berlin Wall fell, and that ended the Cold War, then we in Africa and we in Uganda, in fact, I didn't know that I would take 5 years longer to return to my native Uganda. The reason then was because the Cold War was predominantly fought here on the African continent. And so, by and large, at the time, you knew that if you're Jonas Savimbi, however crude and dubious you were, so long as you say you support Washington and the Comrade Musevenis, you'll get anything. And if you chose like Samoras and others, and you go to Moscow, you'll get anything you want. And if you're the old Miltons, then you go to Washington broadly, and then you go and sneak into China and Yugoslavia, and then you come back, and then you say we are non-aligned, then you'll be considered a suspect, and the best of what you do, you'll be fought, as Sarah said. And by the way, those are the topics. And that's why, interestingly, as we discuss this, it's extremely important, as I was invoking young Africans, that young African students, young Africans, young researchers, young academicians, young guys, particularly in civil society, together with African leaders. I say African leaders at the end because, you know, they're an endangered species at the moment in terms of genuine collective African leaders, whether or not they know some of the things that we talk about and some of the things that we know. So then, unfortunately, Cold War. Currently, the new scramble for Africa centers again on the continent, but unfortunately on DR Congo. Sovereignty, you're asking. From the time of the killing, crude killing of Lumumba, lest people forget, very heartless, the manner in which Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. That country has never been sovereign. In fact, part of the argument I have always made is that what we as Uganda tried to do in the 60s is in part of what started. So we need to help Congo reclaim its territorial integrity, you know, have M23 in, have all these FDL guys said, and say, our borders are up to there, these are the problems we have in, this is how we're going to deal with it, and you neighbors, where are you? Now, whether or not they're able to do that from the kind of people who have the Chikezi is neither here nor there. But next to that, I still have issues with the question of M23. In all this, for Rwanda to say our kin and kith are being mistreated there, we support them and we know that we're actively supporting them, I think it's unacceptable. But once I was talking, I remembered that maybe Kagame knows very well that Rwandese refugees came to Uganda, organized and genuinely went back and reclaimed Rwanda. So Kagame maybe thinks that there will be a repeat on this, which is possible. But point is, isn't it possible, which is part of your question, that we can actually try and help to deal with these things without necessarily causing unnecessary loss of our life? Can't we have these things resolved politically? And must it always now involve the lives and properties and Titan and gold of Congo in order for us to resolve a Banyarwanda question, just like in Luweero it had to break people's necks in order in part to resolve the Banyarwanda question, because that's a fact, you know, or not. And as I said, these are things that we're still going round and round. But look, I think it is genuinely difficult at the moment. Why? Because unlike what Charles is saying, SADC intervention in Congo was really not London, Washington pushed. You know, they may have been their own interest pushed. The neoliberal Washington Bush threats were basically Rwanda and Uganda. And again, we have information, you know, some of these leaders were extremely annoyed with Museveni and Kagame that they lured them into Congo, thinking that they're trying to deal with Mobutu and these new colonial kind of forces in Congo, but Kumbe, they're having an agenda which is different. The SADC position in Congo is, I don't know the latest, is would rather claim Congo, give it sovereignty, and all of us can go ahead and share. Although even some of that share may involve only top leaders, whether from Angola, Uganda, whatever the case. But at least we'd rather share this than leave it to maybe Beijing, Washington, or to agents of Beijing and Washington from within the neighborhood, if you see what I'm trying to say. Now, to me, that is nearest to what is legitimately African. Because it restores sovereignty to Congo, DR, but also brings us nearest to what I was saying, African solution for African problems. And I think if they were smart, where the Mbekis were coming from, you'd rather do that than say the gold or diamond in Goma is African, where are you, London, Washington? We can give you May at half price, which you may not like it, but at least we are giving you a little bit, and then the rest of the continent is having it. And Congo is sharing in the spoils. At the moment, the biggest issue is, as I said, what I was saying, is question of leadership. I don't really think that within our sub-region there is anybody who's going to emerge to say that, guys, let's bang the table and reorganize. I think this leadership will possibly come from somewhere in SADC. At the moment, I don't know, in terms of the current SADC leaders, I don't know who's the kind of person with the voice. It may have to come from somewhere else in Africa. Once in a while, interestingly, Obasanjo, whom I know certain things about, but sometimes Obasanjo these days actually comes out as generally quite sensible. So maybe it might need somebody like the Obasanjos. But maybe it might just need somebody from the progressive left ideology, who may even be a Mzungu who's not Trump, to say, you Africans, what nonsense is this going on? It could even come from the Pope. You know, they say, you guys better settle out these things. But the unfortunate worrying thing is that it is so huge what is at stake, that it's such a scramble that, like Charles says, that anybody who poses a threat may face a threat. But what I don't agree with Charles is that we cannot, as Africans, come and accept, because it's almost like mere blackmail, not what you're saying, but I think that's global reality, that Africans are now fearing to say that, well, if I go and we go in Congo and take a position, that we are a threat because we're going to be overthrown by the West, or indeed overthrown by China. I genuinely think that with the emergence of China and the stalemate in Russia, African leaders, except this Nyampala, leadership can emerge out of this continent and say, you guys, we have this one, I know you're beating us, but at least let's negotiate and come somewhere in the middle. I think it's generally possible. And with the youth population of Africa, if the young Africans are genuinely reawakened again, and I don't know whether you guys are getting me, genuinely reawakened, including with the TikTok world of today, with the youth of Global North that have experience, including in mobilizing. By the way, they're generally more open and progressive. It is possible that we're able to check this so that African resources can be mobilized for Africans and shared with anybody else. Because in any case, quickly, if you don't mind, how did the Middle East manage to renegotiate their wealth for themselves and still allow the rest of the Global North to peek into them?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying
international trade.
So you say, as a continent, Africa can no longer afford to just be a passive actor in its own affairs.
No.
It has to be proactive.
Indeed, and I thought actually the emergence of China was an opportunity, and I think I wrote about this in among my last columns in New African, that the emergence of China gave opportunity for leaders in Africa to emerge and then actually come to the negotiating table and be able to do it. It is still possible. It is still possible. I am genuinely worried that we're discussing Congo, but I'm seeing some of these things die away a little bit. And it's very worrying.
Charles?
That is only possible if you have legitimate leaders.
Well, fair enough. This is what you're saying.
But if you have people imposing themselves on leadership in African countries, leaders who are not accepted by their own citizens, that the governments can only operate within the capitals, they are not felt beyond the capitals. You cannot reclaim sovereignty. You cannot
can I just interject there?
But
Just let him finish.
I'll just give you a point here. Do you know the interesting thing? That actually, as far as this is concerned, to me, not even be about legitimacy. That it's actually possible for us to have African dictators. Just look at the Sahel guys, to have African dictators. But if they have the African interest, they could push. Kagame, and this is an important point for me, Kagame, with my criticism of him politically and democratically, once in a while actually spoke, and Kagame could be one of those, minus the Congo thing. The last of we could easily have some of these leaders simply say, no, this is ours, we're going to be able to do it. They may not necessarily have the direct legitimacy.
But Joseph, again, endorsing dictatorship in a space where we're trying to push for a progressive Africa, I think I find it quite contradictory, because I still would like to assume that we can still have progressive libertarian actors who would still push for African interests other than having dictators in the continent. But Charles?
My argument is you cannot have a strong voice in the international system if you're just representing your own views as a leader. You're not representing citizens. Whatever discussion is in the international community must be institutionalized. It should be owned
Ideally, yes.
by the citizen. And that's why these blocks are not functioning. 3, 4 guys come sit in a room, they are discussing their own views. If you are not representing citizens, the grievances of your citizens, how can those citizens own that stake in the international system? They can't. The Americans speak as Americans, not a president. You must be able to represent the interests of your citizens. And those citizens must own what you say. Because the moment there is a huge gap between the leader and the citizens, then they will just disown whatever you do, whatever you say, whatever you discuss with other leaders. So legitimacy is very, very important. Without legitimacy, Africa cannot have a strong voice. You move around across Kampala and interview people in African Union. Who cares about it? They don't. Who even knows what African Union does? We are here discussing African Union, an entity that is big funded by the Chinese, by the Europeans, by the Americans. So we don't own it as citizens, as Africans. And therefore, it becomes very weak in the international system. And the unfortunate part is that these whites know us better than we know ourselves. That's why they treat AU just as a secondary entity that they don't care about. Because
it's not independent enough.
They know it doesn't represent the continent, the citizens of this continent. If we owned it, we wouldn't even be talking about subscription. You remember here Gaddafi was paying for certain countries because they couldn't, not that they couldn't afford, but they did have interest. The same applies with the EAC. You've had countries like Burundi at times and South Sudan can't even pay membership. But is it true that they don't have money? It's because they don't feel the importance. If a country is suffering, for instance, Burundi had to go through a lot of cycles of violence. What was EAC doing about it? So why should they even be paying to be members? There's the time, in fact, Nkurunziza stopped attending EAC meetings for some years. So there's a problem with the legitimacy. If we solve the issue of governance in our own countries, then the rest we can do, we can handle. In fact, we shall even be respected by the other continents.
Okay. So when we're discussing the DRC and the Great Lakes, I want us to now zoom in on the puzzle called Uganda and where it fits in this conversation of the DRC. I know we've talked about it in passing in terms of the threats that some of these remnant groups pose to Uganda and also the ethnic, Tutsi ethnic questions and so on. But I want us to look at it, to zoom in and have a deeper conversation of Uganda and its role and involvement in DRC.
Well, how does Uganda get involved in DRC? Of course, it didn't start with Museveni. You know, like Joseph has admitted and also said that his former boss, Milton Obote, was involved in DRC. But even so many years ago, we, as Ugandans, we were doing a lot of trade with the Congolese. As far back as 1800 something. So DRC has been, the Congolese have been part of us and we've been part of them. That is why the languages are even similar, we can speak the same languages, but leaving that larger discussion and narrowing it to the current situation, UPDF gets interested in DRC after Kagame approaches Museveni and sharing with him the Congolese mission. And then that's how they pick Kabila from Tanzania, front him as a rebel leader, so that the rebellion could sound as an indigenous Congolese rebellion. That's how Uganda and Rwanda now enter DRC in 1996. But unfortunately, as they are there, they disagree and begin fighting each other. However, like Dr. Sarah has told you, we have legitimate concerns regarding security, especially the ADF, which ADF has now grown beyond what we can manage, because now it has grown into an international terror agency that cannot be handled by Uganda alone. However, minus the security concerns, there are also legitimate concerns that have been expressed by the Congolese people. That Ugandans, we are in the DRC to plunder their minerals. We are there to steal their natural resources. This has even been pronounced by the National Court of Justice. We are even compensating the Congolese for the
timber.
Yes, timber. And unfortunately, they even said we were stealing maize, and very unfortunate.
We were stealing maize and?
Maize, funny things, whatever could come, small. In fact, it is the Rwandese who are taking valuable minerals. For us, we are stealing small things, and we've been made to pay. So every financial year, we are now paying.
We go to the women.
even the women. But as a person, and I've been arguing, when Felix Tshisekedi came in, my view was that it was time for Uganda and Rwanda to stop involving themselves militarily in Eastern DRC and instead empower the Congolese military to be able to manage the situation in DRC on our behalf. Because every time we go there, it has triggered ethnic hate speech. Every time there is chaos in DRC, Ugandans are targeted, Rwandese are targeted. At one time, they had to even burn our embassy. They had to loot our property. And this does not stop only in DRC, but even when Ugandans are in other countries, they are seen from that lens, that these are people who go to steal in other countries.
But what about
cause havoc.
Sorry, Charles, but also we've seen rhetoric from Uganda that could also serve to inflame and ignite tempers from the DRC citizens, perhaps to take certain drastic actions against Uganda, which is still unnecessary and uncalled for. Would you also like to comment on that?
Largely, I don't think the problem has been here. The problem has been with our behavior there, how we conduct ourselves there. If you read details of what transpired from 1996 to 2003, you would cry. The way Congolese were slaughtered like chicken, innocent Congolese, that Pregnant women would even be slaughtered and their wombs pulled out. They would be raped. Very, very bad, atrocious things happened to Congolese. And indeed, they are right to hate us. Our conduct was so bad from 1996 to 2003. Most of those things never appeared in the press. Those Congolese can never forget. In fact, they have become anti-Rwanda, anti-Uganda because of our activities then, when we fronted Kabila and then we started fighting him. So our conduct was terrible. Nobody can defend it.
And it is that past conduct that Ugandans are still paying for to this moment. Yeah.
Up to today, they see us from that lens. The things we did, so terrible. If you read details of what transpired, you would not like us. You wouldn't.
Thank you.
So it is unfortunate that we keep pushing to go back again. Yet we could have redeemed ourselves by empowering the Congolese to solve their own
Are you
problems.
saying we're not there? Why do you say going back?
No, we keep going back.
For other interests?
Every time there's something you hear that we've gone back.
Sarah,
never
let me
left.
come to you still on where Uganda fits in this puzzle piece of the DRC and the Great Lakes.
Well, Uganda has two legitimate interests. One is security, another one is trade. We have a big volume of trade between Uganda and DRC, especially in exporting Ugandan products there for the times when there is a semblance of peace. Like I had said before, in the presence of negative forces in the region, most of them, accommodated in DRC. I don't think that if you have responsibility for protection of Uganda's territorial integrity, you would sit peacefully knowing ADF is across the border. And given the nature of our borders, you sneak into the country, kill people. Since 1997, the Chichwamba massacre, up to today. I think the recent attacks were in Kampala last year. For all these years, now going into 30 years, of a rebel group that you cannot wipe out because it's in a foreign country. If you look at, laws governing hot pursuit in international law, ideally you have a right to pursue your enemy as a country, especially such an established enemy in the neighborhood. But when you mix hot pursuit now with the diplomacy, then you find that you need to agree on how you get rid of that enemy. But ideally, if we had that chance to say, and I know our troops were there under this new cooperation with Felix, say come and wipe out ADF. And then later we went into construction of roads and the rest. But if we had one target to say, we have 6 months of cooperation with the DRC to pursue ADF and wipe it out, I think it would be a good thing. But I think also we diverted ourselves now into many missions. And after that presence in DRC, which is still there. Operation Suja has not closed shop, although it scaled down. But we have attacks on Kasese, Bundubujo, and those areas when we are on the other side. And so sometimes, yeah, you don't understand how. I know that, yeah, fighting such rebel movements could be difficult. And now, given that it's a stronger enemy with this international, the Islamic fundamentalist group. But that's what we need to do as a primary interest, is to stabilize that part of the country. The second interest is like any other legitimate interest of trade. Trade with your neighbors, trade that benefits your citizens. In my view, those are the two legitimate interests. There was a rush to move to put DRC into the East African community, which I think, you know, this aggressive expansion of ESC is at the same time its weakness. It's like focusing on quantity without assessing quality, or focus on quality. I think that countries should be given time to a phased way of joining, like the EU. You don't wake up and join the EU. Or leaders voting for youth fast track. It's a phased process where every criteria must be met. And that's what has made the EU the most powerful integration group. Unlike ESC, where President Museveni wants DRC in, he wants Somalia in, then they will be in. And next target is Ethiopia, without following any due processes. I think that's also the other major weaknesses of having, you know, ambition on quantity without concerns of quality. So these legitimate concerns should be pursued, and they are legitimate concerns for any other state anywhere. The development of international law was to see how do you protect your integrity beyond borders. And that brings me a bit to the threats to Rwanda and why it seems to be more aggressive than the others. Rwanda can be compared in international law with Israel on small size and being extremely aggressive to protect your territory, so many miles away from where you are because of the size. When a country is small, if you don't build capacity or at least ability to threaten, you can be overrun in a matter of days. It's a small territory. The strategic installations are known, and in fewer areas, a greater enemy can threaten you and capture your territory. If, for example, you look at Russia and Ukraine, in a matter of days. So that's what makes these smaller nations extremely aggressive, and I'm not saying it's right or justified, but they tend to secure their borders so many kilometers away from where they are situated. And so that's the behavior and tendency of these small states.
Okay. I want us to talk about sanctions a little bit. There is a thinking that perhaps the UN Security Council should move beyond just mere condemnation and step up and maybe impose targeted sanctions against some individuals, you know, involved in these offensives in the DRC. Do you think that actually targeted sanctions would actually be a solution in a way to stabilizing the DRC? Joseph. Maybe Sarah, then I go to Joseph, yes.
Yeah, but in DRC, whom do you sanction?
Exactly.
Whom do you sanction? I think targeted sanctions work for authoritarian regimes like Uganda, like Rwanda, which are hybrid or abuses of democracy like Kenya and Tanzania, then targeted sanctions are preferred against blanket sanctions that weaken countries and disadvantage people. If you sanction Uganda, for example, for the deteriorating democracy, you are punishing myself, you and others that have nothing to do with the impunity and excesses of the regime. Where evidence exists, it's better to sanction the individuals.
That's what we're saying, targeted sanctions
Yeah,
on individuals.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm making these comparisons. You target individuals that are abusing institutions, abusing laws, and exercising impunity to disadvantage their countries and, you know, create reversals on democracy. So these sanctions are needed in Uganda, are needed in Tanzania over the mass killings, are needed in Kenya over also the killings of Gen Zs, but not DRC. Because in DRC, we are talking of a nation that is not even fit to be called a nation because of the several challenges we have clearly highlighted. So these sanctions should go to the rest of the countries in East African community.
Joseph, over to you.
Yes, in a way, yes, part of what Sarah is saying, and very specifically, you're right, that targeted sanctions, by definition, would be one of the options, except that if in this case one individuals, certain institutions related to certain states, and in this case, in terms of items, and normally it could be on arms and armaments. You could argue that Uganda and Rwanda, you review their defense systems and their associations and their global networks from Qatar to the US itself and others, who supplies them with which kind of equipment they use in breaking people's necks in the streets of Kampala, who supplies them with those crude, ugly-looking equipments that the police use if in the absence of lethal fire, that you use water, those water cannon things that the pictures are doing the round, you pour it onto young Ugandan citizens on borders and breaking and falling as if Uganda is a war field somewhere in Benghazi or somewhere in the corners of Ukraine. Criminal. That must happen, regardless of whether or not we're talking Congo. But talking about Congo, it's also true that following the case against Uganda, I feel extremely sad and disappointed and very annoyed that my children and children's children will continue paying dear Congo when they're individuals we know who went to plunder Congo, who went to rape Congo, and they're walking the streets of Kampala and they continue to rape and rape both in Uganda and in Congo because it's a continued process. If there is international community so-called are genuinely interested in this, they should be targeting those individuals. In fact, if they did that, including with the Uganda-Rwanda thing, way back in 1996, 97, 98, of course, at that time they still thought they were buddies. We would not be having the situations today in Congo. But I just also still need to pick on this thing about the sovereignty question of Congo and the security and economic interests of Uganda. No, we totally agree that we need a stable Congo for us to go ahead and trade with them. That's absolutely fine. But on this security thing, Sarah, I don't think that because we have ADF in Congo, it should justify what we know Uganda and Rwanda are doing in Congo. Like I said at the beginning, it should be the reason for which we do the proactive way, the way UPC and Obote did in the 60s, that we support the processes in Congo by Congolese as a sovereign nation state, recognizing that the stability and resolution of their conflicts in Congo may then help to actually flush out these forces. In any case, actually, when, as I said, Rwandese refugees and Rwandese were involved in a fight against a legitimate, and indeed they help bring down the last democratically elected government in Uganda. Ugandan forces at the time had capacity, by the way, to go to Kigali, but did we go to Kigali? We didn't. In any case, the very same refugees are the ones who went back and got rid of this. So as Africa, I'm not quite sure whether that's really the way. We need to defend our territorial integrity. Agreed. The hot pursuit thing, Sarah, where I'm emphasizing this, there is a risk that the guys in Kampala and Kigali use this as a basis to push their individual interests. In fact, like some of what Charles is saying, because we all know, in detail, that unfortunately, when we talk Uganda and Congo, we are not talking about Uganda's national interest, strategic interest. We are talking Uganda, certain individual strategic interests in Congo, Kenya, and to even to an extent, part of the Rwandan question. The Rwandan question may be slightly broader, because actually, legitimately, the case that the Tutsi broadly in the region, unfortunately, but particularly in Congo, are much more targeted as an identity for which you'd say Kagame may be broadly much more concerned. But in Uganda's case, I think the issue is we know its resources. Congo is also the issue of resources. And as I said, both Kagame and Museveni were client state representatives for foreign interests in Congo. In fact, part of the fallout with SADC was when SADC immediately came to realize that they're being used by these two individuals to help them push the situation in Congo for their interests and interests of others. That's where the difference was. And in fact, they nearly faced the first African World War in Congo. Which brings me to this, and talk about. I actually wonder that maybe one of these days, except that SADC itself is very much conflicted, including some of the leaders, who know some of the issues, that maybe if SADC took a position the way they did in the 1990s and say they are coming to protect Congo, to support Congo, it's maybe one of the ways in which these two brothers might pull back, and then we create space in which all of us, including SADC and East Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, on these particular issues, and Congolese and other Africans to be able to deal with the situation in Congo. Judith, the truth in terms of the death of Congolese between 1995-96 to date is crudely in millions, and they rarely ever hit the headlines. As I said, part of my early campaigns was really, as I said, I repeat, about women and children in Congo suffering as a result of this, minus even actually whether or not Uganda and Rwanda are particularly involved. So it did not really matter who it was, but actually the shameful thing is that our countries are involved. Many times in sometimes global fora, previously particularly, would go ahead and say, but Ugandans were not particularly bad, by the way. We helped you in the 60s, by the way, to try and calm down this, what Charles was saying. Because yes, we are genuinely disliked in that place because of some of the things that we've done. And yet, as Africans, going forward with our children now, going to school and possibly seeking jobs in the next 10, 15 years, you don't want something that... I had an assistant, I think about it, I had an assistant in a particular job in UK who was a Congolese. And the boy told me much later, when he watched me on Al Jazeera discussing Congo, and then he realized that in any case, I was a friend, not a foe. And he came and told me.
So all that time he was looking at you with all that kind of, from that lens
Meaning he could do anything.
Yeah, that's quite risky.
Yeah.
Charles, still on the issue of sanctions, would they or would they not work in this case?
I'm a supporter of sanctions because in Africa, citizens, we are very weak. Our leaders have dominated us with firepower, so there isn't much we can do. But when these foreigners help us and tame the greed of these leaders, it helps, because at the end of the day, it is them buying property in the US, in Europe. They establish their families there. So these sanctions help. I can tell you, some of our people here who have been sanctioned, they are really feeling it.
Sure.
They are feeling it. In fact, they even plead with some activists, please, when you are talking.
In what way? Just in
defenders
what way are they feeling the heat from the sanctions?
There's one I know that after some deployment, his salary couldn't come through.
Salary from the government of
Yes.
Uganda?
Yes.
Oh,
So that's how bad it is.
okay.
So he had to be redeployed somewhere else. I think some of these guys are even paid cash now. So that's how bad the situation can be. Now, there is a guy in Israel called, is it Gatla? I think that is the name. He was an associate of Kabila, and is one of the people that that were prominently siphoning minerals from DRC to the international market. In exchange, he would bring arms. So the Americans sanctioned him after a lot of pressure. That guy almost closed his entire business empire in DRC. And it really weakened him, and it even cut the arms supply to some of those armed groups. So sanctions can work. They can be effective. The problem is that these powerful countries also have their national interests. So they will not sanction somebody who is promoting or who is enabling their national interests. Yet the interests of those powerful countries might not be the interests of the victims in some of these countries.
Thank you, Charles.
They never.
Thank you. And I think I'll just give you each a minute to conclude, and then we'll wrap it up. Joseph, I'll start with you in just a minute.
I don't know how to conclude except to basically just beg Africans to wake up. Basically to beg African leaders currently sitting in the top national offices to review their conscience, to revisit our history, to revisit our independence struggles, to revisit the messages and languages of their struggles for independence for their leaders in their respective countries, what the speeches and whatever they were saying. Many of them would claim they were activists at independent stages, and many of them were, and they were very decent. What is it that they were saying and what has changed? And also to revisit our colonial histories up to leading to the naming of our respective nation states, including in Congo's case. But of course, here talking really about Africa generally. And then also to remember that this continent was divided like sweets in 1884 in Berlin. And really, really, really that today we want to be associated with perfecting the art of that partition so that Africa should continue to suffer like 10 little sweets in the mouth of greedy, salvary, dubious few individuals and then Western allies. I think predominantly it should be shame on them.
Thank you. Dr. Sarah Bireete.
The first problem of Africa is leadership, bad leadership. The second problem is bad leadership, and the third problem is bad leadership. Africa deserves better.
Thank you.
No.
That is it. Okay, Charles, in a minute as well.
Well, me, mine is, of course, on DRC. My appeal would be that would really go straight to President Felix Tshisekedi. His 2 terms of office might wind up without him achieving anything substantial. But the best he could do for DRC is to revive what his father had started, the Sovereign National Conference, where all indigenous Congolese can put their grievances on the table and chart a way forward for the country. Of course, with the support of foreigners, not his strategy of running to foreigners for assistance. It is the indigenous Congolese that have solutions, and they can solve the problems of their country. Therefore, they can sit down together. This process had started during the Mobutu regime. If this man can revive it, he will have left behind a huge legacy for his family.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you for your insights, Mr. Charles Kazooba, Dr. Sarah Bireete, and you, Mr. Joseph Ochieno. My name is Judith Atim. We've been discussing the M23 attacks in the DRC, and we've been asking, what will the Washington peace deal deliver? This is our special edition of the Citizens Chat Show as we head into this festive season and countdown to the end of the year. Do join us, do drop us a comment in the comment section, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and follow us on our various social media platforms. That's on X, TikTok, this particular one, YouTube, and on Facebook. This is the Citizens Chat Show here on Civic Space TV. We'll be back next week, same time. Bye-bye.